the performances.
Oh, you've been using ours?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, cool. Cool. Nice.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I'm well.
Good.
I'm well. It was one of those days where I was here all day and then I raced home to
Oh
do
gosh.
kid stuff.
Right.
I just came back and didn't even think about the fact that I was going to.
Pouring rain.
Yeah, it was snowing at our house.
No.
So it's like, oh gosh, but we're fine.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, anyways.
So what'd you get the last time? How much snow?
Oh, we got 17 inches. We were right in the middle of that snow belt. It was crazy. I actually, so I had to conduct Sunday
Okay.
morning.
Oh.
So I stayed in town.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but then getting home, it took like an hour and a half to get home. But that's better than me trying to fight it on Sunday morning when I got to actually have a deadline.
Deadline. Yeah.
I don't want to,
Well,
I'm probably going to start soon. Thanks for doing this.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to, I'm not even going to count, so I'm just going to say our Tuesday evening event for the Bach Institute. And we are really thrilled to have Professor Teresa Neff, a dear friend of ours from MIT. She is, among many other things, she serves as the Christopher Hogwood Historically Informed Performance Fellow for the Handel and Haydn Society. And she co-edited the Handel and Haydn Society, Bringing Music to Life for 200 years. And her research into the H&H publishing history resulted in the CD, The Old Colony Collection. I'm delighted that her presentation this evening, The Past Becomes Present, Bach's use of the chorale in his cantatas, is such a beautiful, perfect fit, not only with our topic of time, but with so much of the repertoire that we're studying this week. So please join me in giving Teresa a warm welcome.
Thanks, Pam. I'm delighted to be here with you all. I am fascinated by this idea of Bach and time. It's something that I was thinking about as I taught a class last semester at school, and so that everything kind of dovetailed so beautifully. So thank you. I appreciate being here. The other thing I want to say is my interests here are about the listener, both Bach's congregation and how we take in these cantatas today. You know, in Bach's day, you know, how did this chorale resonate with the congregation? The idea of a chorale cantata, how does it resonate for us? We probably can't answer the former question concretely without a document. Right? I need somebody from Bach's congregation who wrote a diary about the chorale cantata that I wanted to study. I can't find one. If you know of one, please let me know. So we can point to things, however, right? We can point to the chorales that Bach chose, chorales he used multiple times, and we can look at the librettist or the libretto and how it uses the chorale text. And then bring in the chorale tune. And that's basically where I'm focusing my attentions this evening. We'll start with a little bit of terminology, and then turn a little more deeply to Cantata 78, thinking about text in particular, and then Cantata 20, where we'll bring in the use of the chorale with the idea of time. So we begin with some terminology. In Martin Luther's time, the word chorale was not used the way we use it today, as a harmonization or as a sacred hymn in the vernacular. Instead, they were basically called holy songs or psalms, church songs. That idea of using chorale may have its roots in the chorus choralis, which was the body of singers in the Lutheran Church who led the singing of the monophonic music, be it Latin chants or be it the vernacular church hymn. And then by the later 17th into the 18th century, into Bach's time, we have that word chorale with an E at the end, referring to the harmonization of a hymn tune, something that we're familiar with today. And then the chorale was used in a cantata long before Bach. In the 17th century, it was a composition for voices plus instruments. This will all sound very familiar to us. 2 or more movements were based on the text, maybe the melody, of a German chorale, and it incorporated a kind of hybrid design, a little kind of motet writing, the chorale itself, maybe recitative and aria, influences from Italian opera. There were 2 different types of chorales. You had the pure chorale cantata, where there was no extraneous text, simply the chorale expounded verse by verse, stanza by stanza. Bach does this a little bit, or a version of it maybe, we could think of it that way, in the first movement of Cantata 78, where he just takes each line by line in a kind of variant. Mixed cantatas add other texts, biblical text, poetic text. The chorale strophes become the kind of structural points, the beginnings, the middles, and the ends. And you might use the chorale tune as a kind of cantus firmus mixed with non-chorale texts. Obviously that cantus firmus style, taking the chorale melody, putting it in long-held notes so that it becomes prominent and used in a different kind of way. There's another thing we can think about with the idea of time, stretching the tune that we're so used to singing into notes that make us think about each note in a different kind of way. But I'm going to start with something that isn't a chorale cantata, the Christmas oratorio. And that may be because it's early January and we just came out of the Christmas season. But one thing that I thought about with this is the use of the hymn tune, the Hostler, right, Passion Chorale, what we might know today as O Sacred Head Surrounded. This melody that shows up in part 1 and in part 6 of the Christmas oratorio, right? A set of cantatas meant to be performed over a period of time during the Christmas season. The first time we hear it in movement 5, it's about how do we embrace this new event, the birth of Jesus. And then when we get to part 6 and the last movement of part 6, same melody, but now the text is a different chorale text that makes reference to the death, the resurrection, and salvation. So Bach has taken us through time in several ways. We have literally gone through the time of each cantata in the Christmas oratorio, hearing it in a succession of days if we are in Bach's congregation. He's taken us through a different kind of time because he's now linking the birth or the Christmas season with the Easter season. So this is, for me, these levels of interpretation, right? We have the idea of the season. We have the idea of the congregation being there, hearing that melody, making associations. I don't know about you, in my early days in church services, if I hear that melody, I think Easter. Doesn't matter what text I'm putting to it. And I think, I'm projecting, right? I don't have that document. But we make these associations based on these melodies that are so familiar to us. And we know that these melodies are familiar to the Lutheran congregations. We know that back in Martin Luther's day, his very good friend Johann Walter created arrangements of chorales and chorale tunes so that they could be sung at home as home entertainment, right? So it's a very interesting, and maybe we don't have the same experience or depth of experience with these tunes as Bach's congregation did. But I think there are still resonances that can apply to us today. So with that in mind, we can turn our attention to BWV 78, Jesu der du meine Seele. This is part of the second cycle of cantatas, which are primarily chorale cantatas, sung on September 10th of 1724. The readings were about living in the Spirit or by the Spirit, the idea that the Spirit is love and joy and self-control. And the gospel was the story of the 10 lepers who were healed by Jesus, but only one of whom, the Samaritan, returned to give thanks for being healed. The chorale tune is the same as our title tune, and the original chorale was 12 stanzas in length. Bach is giving us, the chorale at the beginning, at the end, and we'll come to that in just a few minutes. But first, what I wanted to look at is how the chorale cantata itself is kind of organized. And this is something that, again, this is my interpretation. I've kind of paired the movements. And what I'm doing here is looking at them in terms of the text primarily. We've got the idea of moving from the past to the present, and we have the idea of then moving from the present into the future. And all of this starts to really come through in the text. So what you see on the screen is the text in red is the chorale tune and the chorale text. Any chorale text will be in red. Anything referencing the present tense is in bold. Ideas referencing past events are in italics. And then, of course, we have the beautiful translations as well. So as you can see with the first movement here, we have this idea of through bitter death, right? The implication being Jesus' death, a past event, that today we are rescued and have let all of this be known. This becomes a revelation to the listener, to the believer. This whole first chorus is set in G minor, and we have a personal statement, right, as well. My soul, my treasure. And that changes, and this is where I create in a kind of pairing with the aria. The aria and this opening chorale, it's really a fantasia, they're about the same length. 148 measures for the opening, 144 measures for the opening movement, and 144 with the da capo for the aria. So there's a weight to both of these. And what I hear happening is not just a movement from G minor to B flat major between the two, but also the idea of moving from past to present, and then confirming that present tense, but also taking us from a place of the individual to the community. We go from my soul, my treasure, to the fact that we hasten, we lift our voices. There becomes a kind of widening of not only the time, but also the people who are involved. I think that continues when we can think about pairing the third movement recitative, obviously with its following aria. That aria has no chorale text, but the recitative has pairs of chorale text, quotations from the hymn verses 3, 4, and 5. And they're very nicely placed in terms of the balance of the recitative. And I do start to wonder, as a member of Bach's congregation, we know this tune. We know all the verses. And when you start to hear excerpts in other contexts, then how does that start to change our perception of the text, even of the time itself? What happens, as you can see with movements 3 and 4, the present, the idea of I am a child of sin. We're back to the individual. That gets reinforced in movement 4. But the idea of taking one's burden, right, the result of our past actions, we take those burdens to Jesus now, and all of that is possible because of a past action, Jesus' death and resurrection, canceling guilt. So we're constantly moving back and forth between past and present. Seven, these are the last 3 movements. We start to move from the past, Jesus' suffering, the blood which was poured, to the present. This is a wonderful twist, I give to you. Then we start to look to the future. Now you will still my conscience. And then on to the final chorale, a belief, a confirmation in the future, right? I believe my weakness. And you'll notice that we go back again to that sense of individual statement. This is where I start to think about the idea of Bach's congregation joining in the final hymn, right? I think it would be hard to stop them, is really where I think this lays. A congregation that knows this chorale, has been through this progression. And I've done this in performances in church. You know, I've asked the congregation to specifically do that. Stand and join us in that last statement. And it becomes an incredibly powerful moment. And whether Bach's congregation stood and joined in, whether they sang to themselves quietly, whether it was okay to do or not, there's a sense here of moving from a place of passivity, of listening in, to be active, to being a participant, to standing up and saying, yes, I believe, help my weakness, help, let me never despair, right? So there's a progression here that I think is really powerfully personal, evocative, and probably part of the reason that I find myself coming back to the cantatas again and again and again. If we look just a little bit more closely, this is very small, but what we hear in the very first movement, in the opening, and this is down in the bass, although it gets picked up by the voices as well, we have this descending chromatic fourth, which is traditionally associated with weeping. And so, again, Bach is taking us from this place of sorrow, supplication, to, and this is the closing setting of the chorale, to a place that has stability, to a place that feels affirming. And I think that gives us a kind of sense of harmonic time as well. And we can track that sense of kind of the harmonic time, as well as temporal time, as well as congregational time in Cantata 20, O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort. This was written again 1724. This is the first of his second year of cantatas. Our reading for the day is God is love. One cannot love God while hating others. And with that love is a sense of confidence on the day of judgment. And that's, I think, something key that this cantata is doing in terms of interpretation. So that we have the readings, we have the chorale, we have added text, and all of these become, again, interpretations one on top of the other. The gospel story is the story of Lazarus and the rich man, the rewards and the torments after death. And again, because we just came off the Christmas season, and I read the Dickens Christmas Carol every year as part of my own traditions. And this story and the rich man saying, can't I go back and warn people? Can't I warn anybody that this is about to happen, right? And being told no, the warnings are already there, right? All of this, again, starts to resonate in multiple ways for me. This cantata, of course, is a two-part cantata, and so we have the chorale at the first movement, seventh movement, as our bounding points for part one. We would have settled in for a sermon, had part two, and ending with movement 11. All of these following the chorale, O Ewigkeit. And if we look at the two that are bounding here, so we have the German above and the English translation below. You notice a couple of things. There's a lot of repetition of text. And that repetition of text happens within each chorale stanza, right? O Ewigkeit, and then we go off into different explanations, but also between the first stanza and the final stanza. And here, the first 6 lines are the same, and only the last 2 change. And I think that may have given Bach a little bit of inspiration about setting this particular text. It's a wonderful text. O eternity, you word of thunder, when you think about it, and I don't know if you've ever done this, if you look at a text and you think, well, how would I set it, right? What would I do with this? And I look at this text and I think thunder and timpani and, I don't know, maybe I'm leaning more towards Verdi Requiem than Bach, but, something big and loud and bold. And Bach gives us something different, because I think he's focusing on those last 2 lines, particularly in the first movement. My heart terrified trembles, so that my tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth. We become paralyzed by all of this. So time stops rather than moving forward. And I think that's part of what's happening in terms of the settings. Now, same thing, when we get to the last movement, we have a standard, 4-part Bach harmonization. This is the same harmonization that appears in the 371 that we all probably had to study at some point in our lives. This is a very stable, harmonically logical kind of progression. This is just the first phrase, but all of it has what we expect, right? And I think that's key to what's going on here. So let me just play for us. This is just the last movement of BWV 20. if we go back now and just take a look at the text and translation, right? Eternity, you word of thunder, sword that bores through the soul, beginning without end. Eternity, timeless time. I know faced with great sorrow, not where to turn. And then here's the change. Take me, when it pleases you, Lord Jesus, into your fortress of joy. We end on that sense of hope. We end on a place where eternity is not terrifying us into absolute paralysis. Time is not stopped. Here, time is moving forward. It completes. It's logical. But when we go to the first movement, I think things are a little bit different. The chorale tune is in the soprano in augmentation, setting it off, right, in those notes that would allow us to kind of dwell on each pitch or each moment of the chorale tune. But underneath that, the altos and tenors are doing things that are okay and expected. But it's the bass. The bass moves from that F to an E flat. We're in F major. We should move from F to E natural, right? But that extra half step pulls us away. It creates a wonderful wedge, right? The bass is going down, the soprano's going up. So we have this wonderful sense of expanse happening, another maybe sense of time that way. But it becomes unsettling. It's an instability. And this is the beginning of instability that Bach will just keep pushing. But not the way, as I said, I would have used trumpets and drums. Bach's not going there. This is incredibly subtle. And he gives us instability, stability at the same time, because underneath it all, he just lets the continuo sit on F. So here we are, stable. And in fact, we're slipping. Something's not quite the way we expect. That continues in the second phrase of the chorale. The soprano continues up, completes with the E natural to the F. Notice our continuo is still just hanging out on F, on that pedal tone. And then we get some text painting. Basses, man, what a great thing to do. Basses are our thunder, right? But the alto, the tenor, and the bass finish after the soprano, right? The tune kind of gets lost because the thunder keeps rumbling. So time is being kind of extended here a little bit by this extra statement in the lower three voices. And the other part of that is, yes, we end on F, but we don't do it in that typical kind of perfect, authentic cadence kind of way. We just kind of go there, right? And that gives us a completely different sense. So with that in mind, let's give a listen to the opening of this cantata. So as we go on, we'll start to notice that Bach is doing something else with this first movement. He has created a kind of French overture style. You heard it in the ya, da, 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 da of the opening, and that homophonic kind of texture in the instrumental parts. And overlay that with the part for the chorus. We come into a kind of B section, which in the French overture style becomes imitative, and the instruments will absolutely take us there. But there's another change. It's a change of time. We move from duple meter into triple meter. So we start to dance a little bit, even though our text, "O eternity, timeless time," right? We're starting to play with this sense of musical time itself. The imitative textures, imitation is a wonderful way to suggest something stretching beyond its initial phrase structure. So there's a sense of eternity being suggested there as well, I think. And then as we go on, we get into the last two phrases, that I know not before such great sorrow where to turn. And this is where things start to intensify. The voices get descending chromatic figures. At the word nicht, the text separates out for the altos, tenors, and basses, separated by rests, so that each iteration of the word becomes a moment in and of itself. And all of these things come together to take us into these final two lines. My heart, completely terrified, trembles so that my tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth. We have the descending figures become intensified, as do the idea of the short-long figure or the long-short, ya, da, 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 da. It actually moves from ya, da, da to da, 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 right? On top of that, the instruments are going to take us to an unresolved diminished seventh chord, and they're not going to bother to finish it. They just stay there, and then we get the reversal of the rhythms into a short-long idea, and the bass part, the continuo part, gives us augmented fifths and tritones, just one each, and then we go into a cadence. All of this is just, in my interpretation, everything's starting to fall apart, right? And from the listener's perspective, we can feel this. We don't need tremolos, and we've got the rhythms, we've got the harmony, and we have the lack of expectation. And all of that just leaves you feeling as if time has stood still, even though things are still moving forward. So what I'd like to do, if I can do this, is I'd love to go back. Let me see if I can go back. Let me go this way. I'm going to take us back to where the middle of this first movement, all right, where we start to get the changes. Did I do that right? I'm not sure I did that right. We'll get there. We'll do it this way. All right, this is about where we left off. terrified trembles so that my tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth. And I guess we can say it all ends okay, right? We end on a cadence, but you can hear how the instruments, so confident in the beginning, even they start to feel that pressure, right? And I think that's the part that becomes so fascinating. And it takes the entire rest of the cantata through two parts to bring us to a place of kind of confident resolution that we hear with that last stanza. And again, I would just imagine the congregation now standing and joining in with this and feeling that sense of eternity not paralyzing them, but the idea of invigorating them and allowing them to have hope and determination. And that's where our last stanza takes us, right? Take me when it pleases you, Lord, into your fortress of joy. Moving from a place of past with fear of eternity based on past actions, our past actions, through the process that takes us into the present and again into the future. These kinds of movements, I think, they just couldn't be lost on Bach's congregation. And just I'll end very, very quickly with another cantata, Cantata 140. I won't play it for you. Wacher auf, you can probably hear it in the beginning already. But we have the story of, you know, the bridegroom coming and the bridesmaids going out to meet, the wise and the foolish bridesmaids. But again, Bach takes and makes a very weighty first movement, right? Built out of time, built out of musical time, moving. And we always have that sense of motion in the instrumental ensemble. And it always gets offset by what we hear in the chorus. And the fascinating thing there for me is that we always keep coming back, right? The instrumental parts, the alternation is fabulous, but it also keeps us stuck in a wheel of never really going anywhere, right? We're waiting for something to happen, but we don't quite get there. We have to wait, again, through to the end of the cantata. Same thing happens in something like Cantata 61, right? Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland, we're waiting. And finally, at the end of that cantata, we get the last phrase of a different chorale, how brightly beams the morning star. So Bach has created a connection or a movement between Advent and anticipation and the fulfillment of that with the birth. I think all of these passages, and these are just, you know, few, and there's many others that I'm sure you all could think of. I just focused on these partly because that's the focus of what we're doing as part of the Bach Institute. But I think each time these chorale melodies were heard or texts were referenced, there was a possibility for a new interpretation, right? Bach is giving us interpretation, the librettists are giving interpretations, but every time it's being heard by the congregation, they're bringing something to it as well. So there's another kind of community, right? Individual and hearing it together. Part of the reason I think that we listen to live music, it's individual experience shared communally. And certainly that's true of how we would hear these cantatas, whether Bach's congregation or today. And hearing these chorales in these different contexts gives it another kind of temporal dimension or association. And I think that's the thing that brings us back to them, because it just invites us to listen to them differently each and every time. We bring something different to the experience each and every time, and so we start to hear different things in different ways. You know, with Cantata 20, the whole idea of using that French overture style, you know, very obvious changes that would be immediately picked up on. And yet, what's going on underneath that are other subtle changes that you might not have heard the first time, right? We get to come back and hear them again and again and again. Bach's congregation maybe not all picked up on it. Maybe not even all the singers and instrumentalists picked up on it. But I don't think it denies the fact that it's still there. I think Bach was putting it there, which is part of the fascination of these works for me. So with that, I would love to open the discussion to everyone. Your ideas, your other cantatas that you can think of that bridge that sense of time would be great.
So we have a talkback mic set up here, and I invite anyone that has a question to come up to the mic. I know that we can all hear each other in the room, but this is for the sake of our live stream audience, who will then be able to fully participate in everything. And I want to give a particular invitation to our fellows to come and pose questions of Teresa. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any thoughts? Frank, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You give us an awful lot to think about and savor, really. It's wonderful. So I just wanted to extend, maybe think about the chorales also for organ, the chorale preludes. Mm-hmm. And a couple of things. In terms of how Bach, when he worked on the cantatas, and when he went from, is there a temporal relationship between when he composed chorale, both first movement and final movement scores for the cantatas versus the organ chorale preludes? That's one question. And secondly, how much of harmonic wizardry and adventuresomeness is shared between the organ chorale preludes and the choral renditions in the cantatas?
Ooh, excellent questions. I'm going to start with the second one first. I haven't personally looked, and I'm going to open this up. Other people might have more information than I do. I've not looked at them harmonically in that way to say, oh, this is more adventurous than that one. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, something like Through Adam's Fall, right? That's fabulous, right?
Yeah, that one has seems like it has 3 Stallen.
Yes, yeah.
And it's in the fall.
And the fall is in the pedal, and there's no mistaking that 7. Yeah, absolutely. But is that harmonically adventurous? Bach will use chromatic inflection. In 78, that descending chromatic fourth. He didn't invent that, but he knew where to use it. And I think that might be the way I would think about it. He's very good at knowing where to use a particular inflection, right? Sorry, your first question was about...
Just the temporal relationship. Did he compose them close to the same time?
To the chorale preludes and the cantatas, to the best of my knowledge, there's several years in between, right? And what order he wrote the cantatas, movements of the cantatas, I think that's almost impossible to figure out. He's working, we know he worked incredibly quickly. We know that he would choose his texts basically either Sunday night or Monday morning. He starts writing that week. And, when I took a Bach class myself as an undergraduate, the joke was that if you lived in Bach's house, and he had, not all the children were obviously at the same age at the same time, but there were probably 8 or 10 people around the dinner table at any one point, and that included apprentices who might be living in his home. If you were old enough, after dinner you copied out parts because it was a production line. And Bach would finish the work probably Friday, you rehearse Friday, you fix it Saturday, you do it Sunday, you start all over again. And he did this for years. And then I think he was exhausted. Not creatively, but physically. This is, incredibly exhausting work. And then to be, leading the St. Thomas students musically and being in charge of music in all the churches for the city of Leipzig. This is an incredible task. So I think it's hard for us to know, he started with this movement, he did that movement. But it is interesting that the chorale cantatas work like a reverse theme and variation, right? You always get the tune, the 4-part harmonization at the end, as in, I think, affirmation. And you always, most of the time, you get the more complex movement first. See what we can do with this kind of idea, which I think is really fascinating. Yeah.
This is more of a thought than a specific question, but as we're talking about the beginning and the end sort of lining up, I know Bach was really interested in rhetoric,
Yep.
and to me it sort of suggests the exordium and the peroratio ending as we've begun, but it's elaborated first. But I think, coming to the congregation's level, it's not as musically complex, it's even more familiar. I think maybe it was a rhetorical choice to end more simplistically. Just a thought.
I think that's a great thought. And a great idea, right? Yeah, it's teaching.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean,
right? How many ways can we say this?
And the Lutherans were so interested in rhetoric and the education of that, and
Yeah.
it's just an extension. I don't know.
Absolutely. I think that's fabulous. Yeah. Thank you.
One of the things we've been talking about at the Institute thus far is sort of this idea that Bach kind of operates with music on a different level. I mean, we all know that, but that is to say that I think Bach really engages not just with text, but also with subtext. Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned earlier about if I were to set O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, this text, you said how you would set it. You said you mentioned timpanis and sort of maybe something with a little more bombast, but Bach approaches it in a way that is, I think, very subversive to the audience's expectations. Mm-hmm. And so my question is that what do you think what is the benefit to the congregation if we can kind of try to peer inside Bach's head, what do you think is the benefit to the congregation of deliberately subverting audience expectations for these texts? Yeah. Like, why would he choose to, zag when the congregation expects him to zig? What does what does the congregation get out of that, I wonder?
I wonder if it doesn't make them pay attention more, right? Because when you shout at someone, you get one reaction, but if you whisper, you get a different reaction. And so I think you're right. He's being subversive about the whole thing. And, he sets this text again in Cantata 60, sort of the other way around. But it's a dialogue cantata between fear and hope. So again, there's the tremolo, that gives us that fear and trembling idea, but it's a subtle, kind of subversive setting, not what you would necessarily expect. I think you pay you pay attention. You might sit up and pay attention a little bit more. You might think about it a little bit differently, right? Horror movies are great at this, right? When things get quiet, you know something's going to happen. And I think that's part of what, that terror, that paralyzing fear. I really think that's what he was capitalizing on this first movement.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
So I'm curious, do we know, in fact, that Bach had a free hand with the text, or did he have to negotiate what he was doing with the text with the ministers in the congregation or the people who are in charge of the theological aspects of this?
The text tended to be published, and he would choose text. It's a little bit of both. He had a free hand in some ways. The texts were chosen in order to support the readings of the day. So, there was always a connection being made there. Sometimes, and that happened with the Christmas oratorio texts, but that was because Bach was publishing them in advance. He was told, like, no, you can't do that. So there were some back and forth that way, but I think he was able to choose texts fairly freely, as long as they supported what was the liturgical function. Yeah. Am I allowed to ask a question? Please. Do you all have a favorite time cantata? Or anything that fits with that, with the topic?
This is a good opportunity for you all to advocate for any of the repertoire. Yeah.
It is a difficult question. Well, and I'm asking it because, quite frankly, putting this together, it was hard to figure out where and where you wanted to go.
There's several I like, so I can't really pick just one.
It's hard to pick one or two, or yeah, I agree. But even the concept of like how Bach is using time makes us think about the repertoire differently, which I think is really, really fascinating.
But one thing I have to wonder is,
Could you come to the mic?
Okay.
Would you mind?
okay, yeah, all right then. Well, comparing with Emmanuel, I know Emmanuel does theirs at the end of the service. Where did Bach do his?
Before the sermon.
But in the
It's kind of in the middle. Because
in the middle of the service.
basically, yeah. So you would have the opening Kyrie Gloria, you'd have the readings, you'd have the cantata, you'd have the sermon. So that when those cantata texts are there to support the readings you've just heard, then you get a musical elaboration of that, and then you settle down for the sermon. That's going to be another elaboration on that.
Okay,
So a little bit different placement than what we're doing today.
okay.
I guess I have a question more relating to relation of the text to the humanity of people and kind of the connection that people have to some of the texts that he used within his chorales. And I was curious of, was there an intention of trying to create this sense of, how do I put it? This sense of nostalgia or a sense of remembrance with a lot of the works that were, especially in the very end, it's kind of everybody knows how this tune goes, especially a lot of the text that was used throughout, and it's kind of pinpointed and spread amongst. Was that kind of an intentional thing, or would you think that's kind of an intentional thing that Bach did in order to also kind of connect with the people and who they are themselves within the congregation, if that makes sense?
I think if I understand what you're saying, so not Bach but the librettist,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
who
sorry, yes.
who would take, as they did in '78, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take a couple of lines from verses of the chorale tune
Mm-hmm.
and use that as almost structural points, right,
Yeah.
in that recitative. I think it's on purpose. I think it's there to create a sense of recall, to give,
I wasn't sure if it was more so just about the fondness of hearing certain texts, and you're like, oh, nice, or if it's more meant to be like a moment of pause, or maybe both. In the sense.
It could be both, right? And depending on the text, it could, and depending on the text, depending on its context within the cantata, depending on the context that any one listener would bring, right? And I think that's why it's such a rich repertoire, because you've just got so many layers of interpretation possible. Yet at the same time, I don't think anyone's going to argue, oh, eternity, you thunderous word, is kind of daunting.
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's a commonality there, something shared, but also a very individual experience, which is part of what I'm, that's kind of a corollary, the idea of the individual in the community. So if I'm
No, certainly.
getting to your point, there is there's a nostalgia
I'm a Bach
there.
secular instrumentalist, so that's all I really know.
But I think you're right. I think there is this, recall, right? And so is that nostalgia bringing a smile to your face? Is it making you slightly uncomfortable? Does it remind you of an argument you had with someone? There's a lot of ways of recalling things, I think your point is well taken. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a very practical question, which speaks to my ignorance of Bach. That is that, and you illustrated that when you were talking about that particular cantata where you expected timpani and trumpets, and you got something entirely different, or we got something entirely different. I'm wondering, to what extent was Bach affected by the amount of money he had to spend on instrumentalists? I mean, what if he didn't have timpani and trumpets available? So he had to compose something without them, but with the same effect.
Like any artistic director today, he fought that battle too. Yeah. And we don't have many letters from Bach, but we do have a couple of letters. One very famous one where he's complaining to the town council, his bosses, that he doesn't have enough singers. He doesn't even get to instrumentalists. Because the students of St. Thomas are his choir. And with that choir, he must supply choral music at St. Thomas and St. Nicholas and 2 other churches. And so he writes to them and he says, look, till they get sick, till this happens and that happens, I don't have enough singers. So I think that's actually a very interesting question. What did Bach have available at the time? How does that very practical concern get reflected in the end product? That someone like me sitting here in 2024 says, oh, Bach was so this, so that. Well, maybe there were really very practical reasons for that too. Doesn't take away from the ingenuity though, right? But no, I think you're absolutely right. He had, he brought in ringers when he had to, because that was, nothing in that respect has changed.
Any other questions? Anyone want to vote for their favorite timepiece?
It's too hard.
Yeah. Well, then, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think this was a wonderful contribution to the discussions and the work that we're having. And certainly, as we continue to study Cantata 78 and 4 movements of 20, all of what you've shared with us will really help us bring that forward. And I'd like to invite everyone on the live stream and in person to our next public event, which is in 2 days, Thursday evening, where we'll hear from our very own Rector Pamela Wernz and Dr. Karen King from the Harvard Divinity School, asking questions about translation backwards and forwards. Thank you very much. Thank you.